Hey, welcome to this week's Haftarah. It's Beha'alotcha, if I'm saying that one right. Zechariah chapter 2, verses 10 through chapter 4, verse 7. So Zechariah was, he was a prophet, but also from the priestly line. And he was born during the Babylonian captivity. But he was one of the first ones to return to Israel after Cyrus had made it possible for them to return. And our Haftarah will cover two of his prophecies. So he has 8 in total. And the ones that the Haftarah covers will be the one that describes the priest with dirty clothing, and that has to do with God's cleansing of the priesthood. And the other one is the vision of the menorah, and that has to do with bringing forth light through the work of the Spirit of God. Now, if you have not already read this Haftarah, make sure that you do, because there's a lot of really meaty things in here, and I had to read it a couple of times in order for it kind of to make sense to me. So the Torah portion this week, if you've read that, that starts with the instructions for Aaron, the priest, regarding the maintenance of the menorah. And so that's the tie-in with this Haftarah, because, like I said, Zechariah's second vision and prophecy was of the menorah and 2 olive trees. So I decided to focus on just that first vision, the priestly clothing. So in Zechariah's vision, it's centered on the high priest Joshua and his filthy garments. It talks about them being removed. So his sin, and that he's representing the sin of the people. The sin is cast away, and he's dressed for a feast in these wonderful robes. And he is basically a new man because he has on new clothes to wear. And Isaiah 64:6 kind of uses that same metaphor to describe God removing the filthy rags of sin and replacing them with righteousness. And then in the renewed scriptures, the Brit Hadashah, Paul uses that same language. So what's interesting is that in the ancient world, much more so than today, clothes were an identifier. And so they weren't just something that protected against the elements or was used for modesty. And, you may be able to think of some examples, purple for royalty, right? And then what did people wear when they mourned in ancient times? Sackcloth, right? Sackcloth and ashes. And then different professions wore different clothing. And so you could pick out what somebody did by the clothing that they wore. So the reason I decided to focus on just this one little aspect of clothing, it was kind of interesting. So last week, my husband and I visited our youngest son. He lives in New York City. And one of the things while we were there, he suggested that we take a sort of like a leisurely stroll throughout one of the Jewish neighborhoods. That we would do that on a Sunday, and then he said we could stop at a deli and then maybe walk a little bit more and see some of the shops and maybe get something else to eat. So sounds like a fun afternoon, right? Yeah. And it was. And so we were walking the streets of New York to get to our destination of this Jewish neighborhood. And there wasn't any, it wasn't possible for us to not know when we got into that neighborhood. And not because there was a big sign that says Jewish neighborhood, but it was because of the distinctive clothing that the men and the women wore, right? What they wore were obvious signs of their identity. And it was also obvious when we would continue to walk and we left that neighborhood. It was obvious based on how the people were then dressing, right? So, and what was interesting was when we left the neighborhood, I thought about how, well, I can no longer tell who is a believer, right, who follows after God, unless I ask that person directly. But when I was in the Jewish quarter, I was able to just know by seeing, that these people followed after God. Now, I myself don't dress in a way that would identify me as an Orthodox Jew, because I'm not. But it made me wonder if somebody could look at the clothing that I wear, and just by the clothing, if they would be able to identify me as a woman who's passionate for God, just by the way I dress. And I don't usually think about that kind of thing that much, but that experience in New York and then this Haftarah really kind of got me to thinking about clothing in a different way. And it got me to wonder if there actually is a relation between like my outer clothing and my inner character. So I've never really been one to follow like the latest fashion designer labels, even when I was younger. And it's funny that for some reason I refuse to wear a shirt that has like Nike or some kind of company brand on it, because I don't want to be like, I pay for the shirt and then I'm a walking advertisement for that company, right? Now, I'm not coming against you who do, because I mean, these shirts are everywhere. It's just this weird hang up I have. I don't want to be associated with this. Well, it's just that I don't want to give free advertising to a company where I've already paid for their things. So, but I do sometimes think about what I'm going to wear, because I want to be acceptable. I want to fit in. I don't want to be an oddball, which is ridiculous because I am. So I guess it's good to think about the fact that it's God's righteousness given to me through Yeshua that makes me acceptable, not what I do or don't wear, right? So again, the trip to New York, seeing that neighborhood, this Haftarah, made me think about some things that I hadn't really thought about in a long time. It brought me to Proverbs 10:8, that says, the wise in heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will be ruined. So the rabbis teach that without a mitzvot, or without the commandments, one is naked, which is kind of interesting. So Judaism sees commandments as literal things, like things that can be possessed or acquired or put on, like clothing. Isn't that interesting? So they don't necessarily think of commandments as actions or duties or rules, but they think of them as clothing, protective, like a protective shield, and clearly a valuable treasure that needs to be taken care of and protected, right? So back in that verse in Proverbs that I just quoted from, it's more accurately translated, the wise in heart will acquire or put on commandments. And then I found this interesting study from Skip Moen, and you've heard me quote from him before many, many times. So this is kind of an extensive quote here, but it's really cool. He says, what this means is the wise man or woman deliberately pursues the commandments as if they could be possessed as priceless treasures. There's never any sense of obligation here. There's only the sense of desire and passionate acquisition. The wise man desperately wants the commandments in his life because they're so valuable to him that he could not feel at home in the world without them. He would be naked except for their protection. The first lesson is the one of personal confrontation. Do we passionately pursue God's instructions? Do we value them as priceless treasures? Most people say they believe, but they do what they value. This verse challenges us to examine our values. And then he goes on to say that the Hebrew background to an idiom about putting on new man fits in here. And that's taken from 2 Corinthians 5:17, Ephesians 4:24, and Colossians 3:10. And Skip Moen goes on to say, Paul is telling us that being a new creature in Messiah is the same as acquiring the commandments. God's grace lets us put on the commandments like a new set of clothes. We're naked without them. We're to put on new garments that match who we really are. Because in Hebrew thought, the outer display is supposed to be a tangible exhibition of the inner character. I am to look at the same on the outside as I am on the inside. That's the end of his quote, and that's really cool, I think. So let's just take a quick peek at Colossians 3:12. And so, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Okay? So, the Greek word for put on is the verb enduo, and that's a picture of getting dressed, which is really cool. So you pick out what you're going to wear and you put on clothing, right? So the sentence literally says, put on, therefore, as elect ones. It emphasized the action of getting dressed, not the selection of what to wear. Okay? So think about this. In order to put on the garments, and remember the garments we're talking about here in Colossians is compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. So in order to put these on, we have to do something. In this case, we have to take the necessary steps to wrap yourself in these things. Okay? Again, Skip Moen says, you can't sit naked in a room waiting for God to dress you in compassion and kindness. I love that. So by the language that's used in this verse, we're actually not being asked to wait until God changes our heart before we exhibit compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, or patience. Okay? So let me say that again, because that's the key lesson, I think. We're not being asked to wait until God changes our heart toward those things before we can exhibit them. So the power that we have is in choosing to get dressed, choosing to put on compassion, kindness, humility. Not how you feel about it, right? So you can already exhibit those actions towards somebody else or toward yourself, even if you don't feel like it, and even if it right now feels unfamiliar. So I could go on and on and on about clothing, but I think that's enough for now, for this lesson. And I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah.